I know how it is. It's after lunch, the most difficult slot to fill. And if I put chart after chart on the screen here, I'm sure you would all be asleep very, very quickly. So I've given you no charts at all. I'm just going to give you the key ideas, okay? But please go and have a look at the documents if you want to look at the detail afterwards. This morning we heard lots of really interesting examples of transformation that's taking place in the cultural and creative economy, not just in Kazakhstan, but in the region. We got a sense of the huge growth and role of the youth population in this transformation that's taking place. What we don't have, though, is some concrete reporting of this information. And what I've got to say today provides something of that, but it's not of what's been happening in the last year or 2 years, effectively. Such is the nature of statistics that we collect. So what I want to just to remind you of, which is one of the points that we made last year, and that several people have made this point already, is that the creative economy is a thing globally. Okay, so the cultural and creative industries, more broadly the creative economy, is something that has been recognized internationally and has been undergoing a transformation in terms of growth and development over the past 20, 25 years or so since we've been collecting data on it. And we can point to these international statistics such as the UN Commission on Trade and Development pointed to this growth, and the rate of growth in this field is fairly significant. The cultural economy in the 21st century has grown on average by 8.8% per annum, which is a dramatic amount, okay? So most economies in Europe and North America will be very, very happy with 2%, and most of them considerably less. So 8% is a real growth sector of the economy. It's the sort of rate that China used to be growing at, yeah? So this is very, very significant in terms of we've got parts of the economy that we didn't recognize before that actually something's happening with them. And moreover, growth in transitional economies and the global south is even faster. So this is not just something of the developed world. It's part of a story of transformation and change. In Kazakhstan, we can see that exports have increased something like 32% and imports by 19%. So there's huge growth going on here and huge change. However, for Kazakhstan, the story is not quite so good in the sense that there's a negative balance of trade. In other words, you're importing more stuff than you're exporting. So in the cultural sector, so that needs to grow. But the rates of change are fast. So this is something that we can see is changing quite significantly. As regards Kazakhstan's position in relation to other similar countries in transitional economies, Kazakhstan is actually not so different to many of those countries. So it's not falling below, but it has great potential to grow from this point. However, as you all know, Kazakhstan's economy is one that remains dominated by mineral products, but the point is that the creative economy is, from a small start, growing very, very quickly. And the growth in the cultural economy is significantly a significant size. Overall, employment in the whole economy, and this is the same for the region as a whole, the agricultural employment is falling, manufacturing is more or less stable, and the service sector is growing. And it's the cultural economy is growing as part of that service sector growth generally. So this is part of the transformation of moving towards a new foundation for the economy. services grew from representing literally half of employment to something like 61% in this period. However, one of the major problems in this area is actually getting any concrete data on these changes. The data that we have on the cultural economy is very, very poor. And this is partly because it's a whole new field that has developed. People just didn't collect data on this field because they didn't think the cultural and creative economy was important. So therefore, there's no data there. There is some data, and I'm going to tell you about that in a moment. So just to tell you a little bit about the background of this program, we know the program. We started with an initiative this time last year, trying to discuss the emergence of the creative economy in the region. And people were pointing to one of the things that they wanted to be literally put on the map. They wanted to be measured and to be able to compare themselves with other places, but also to be able to speak back to central government to say the cultural and creative economy actually matters. It's part of the economy and it needs to be noticed in some way. And this is part of what we tried to do. We didn't just set out to collect some figures, but some figures that will be comparable to those that are being collected elsewhere in the world. So they will be systematic and that they would be using similar definitions to those that are used elsewhere. So that's what we set out to do. A number of challenges in this field, and you know, I pointed these out last year, and they still remain as a challenge. That any area of the economy that is growing and changing, that is innovative, is by definition very difficult to measure, because we construct our measurements based on what things were like yesterday, or rather several years ago. So the new things tend to not be seen very clearly. And that's certainly the case for the cultural economy. The statistical agencies tend to have not invested in resources in that area, and therefore we have a rather patchy picture of this. But what we've tried to do is to create a framework that as new data is collected by central statistical agencies, it can be put in the framework that we have here. So what we have managed to get is information, as we see here, mainly on the number of businesses. And we can see a number of things about the changes in the nature of the businesses in the culture and creative sector, and also by location and by year. So that gives us an idea of those businesses. It doesn't tell us about the actual employment, and it doesn't tell us about the actual value of the output. They're things that are going to have to follow. But this is the first indication that we have of this change. So what we can say, this is the key slide in a way that conveys the major findings here, is that the creative industries do form a significant part of the total business base in Kazakhstan. There are something like 18,000 creative businesses registered in Kazakhstan, and that makes up something like 3.84% of the current industrial business population. Okay, so that it's something that exists, and compared to many other countries, that's probably about half the position that they've got, but the rates of change here are very quick. The key point is that most of these firms are concentrated in two cities, Astana and Almaty, and they account for 62% of the creative businesses. I guess compared to, so that's 62% of creative businesses compared to 42% of all businesses. So in other words, the cultural and creative economy is overrepresented in Astana and Almaty, and they're the places where population and also economic development is happening most quickly. So again, I point to the fact that the creative economy is there with the bleeding edge of change. So this is the area to definitely look at. Another aspect, and we find this across the world in terms of creative businesses, that something like 75% of the creative businesses in Kazakhstan have 5 persons or less. So these are very, very small companies, micro companies, and as I'll mention towards the end, there are a number of challenges that brings with it in terms of actually understanding and helping those activities. The main representatives of the culture and creative economy are the sort of business services end of the culture and creative economy, such as advertising, architecture and software, information and communication. Arts and cultural making themselves, the traditional arts, only make up about 6 or 7% of those. So it's mainly about the newer forms of the digital, the software-related aspects of the culture and creative economy that are the ones that are growing. And they're the ones that we find elsewhere that have fastest growth rates and also most value added and employment associated with them. So one of the challenges, the things that we don't know, really, is how many people are employed here. And we really have to put some pressure on central governments to see if we can extract this sort of information from them. There should be information in the national census that we can use to help us in this way, but at the moment, we don't have that depth of information. Also, the things that we don't know and we need to begin to find out about is who the markets are. Who are the culture and creative businesses selling to? Who are they interacting with? Because we need to know these linkages in the economy and how they are developing. And also, significantly, of course, we need to know what the turnover of these businesses is, how much money they're making, how much they're creating. What we also don't know yet is about the balance of the role of the state and the private market as consumer here. So the balance of the state and the market are undergoing changes in Kazakhstan, and we need to know actually what is who's buying these goods. And finally, in terms of the things we need to know something about actually how the culture and creative sector is organized. So often the culture and creative industries work in a sort of ecosystem. So lots of small firms linked to one another through contracting arrangements. And those linkages are about, as in a natural ecosystem, they're what supports the activities. So we need to know more about that if we want to know how to sustain and support this. So just to a few points before I finish is that the national economy is changing. Population change is around about 7%, and 27% of that is in Astana and Almaty. Overall employment growth has stalled. And I guess the point that I wanted to make is contrasting those figures on the culture and creative industries, that the growth rate is faster in the culture and creative industries than the population is increasing, and also the focus on the 2 cities as well. So, as I mentioned before, what we need is some more detailed information. So this is a launching pad, a start, that we can see how many businesses there are and where they're concentrated. But now we need to go a bit further to find out the employment issues associated with them. And I guess this agenda of skills and training are only really going to be able to develop when we know exactly what is actually there in the real world. And we desperately need to have some more information on that if we're going to tailor our skills and training agenda to fit with what we're looking forward to. And hopefully that will create a sound foundation for what seems to be a significantly fast-growing area of the economy, and one with a considerable amount of potential for the future. Thanks very much.